Centuries ago, when the domes of Constantinople still glowed under the copper sunlight, and the call to prayer echoed over tiled rooftops like a lullaby carved into the wind, there existed a place so cloaked in beauty that even its name stirred curiosity in distant lands: the Ottoman Imperial Harem. People in far-off kingdoms whispered about it as though it were a myth, a paradise veiled behind stone walls, where silken-robed women lounged on jewel-toned cushions, their fingers dipped in honeyed fruit, their eyes lined with kohl, waiting for the gaze of a sultan whose power stretched across empires. But what they never saw, what no map recorded and no painter dared to capture, was that this paradise was also a prison, and the silk was stitched with silence. They called it the harem, and to many, it sounded like a dream. A royal court of women chosen for their beauty, trained in music, poetry, and the delicate dance of intrigue. They came from across the known world: Greek islands, Slavic villages, Circassian highlands, African coasts bought, taken, gifted, or surrendered. Each girl renamed, reclothed, and rescripted into a story not of her choosing. To outsiders, they became symbols of pleasure. To the empire, they were assets counted, ranked, priced, and to themselves, they were 1,000 versions of the same question: how do you survive a life that isn't yours, inside the marble walls? Time moved differently. Days were structured by ritual: wake at the call of drums, bathe in rosewater, polish the skin with ground pearl and saffron, learn the rules of obedience, the art of catching a glance without appearing bold, the correct way to bow without revealing too much shame or too much pride. They were taught to sing in languages they didn't speak, to dance before eyes that measured them not for their grace, but for the softness of their waist. They learned quickly the harem was not a home, but a stage where survival meant applause, and applause meant protection, and protection, if you were lucky, meant you would not be forgotten tomorrow. Among them were girls, no older than 12, standing barefoot on tiled floors, clutching pieces of their mother, tongues in their mouths like forbidden sweets, trying not to cry where guards could see. They were told to smile, to remain still during inspection, to lift their chins and keep their eyes lowered. Sometimes a merchant would pass through, sometimes a palace official. The girls would be touched, measured, inspected for blemishes. Some would be taken away. Others would remain marked as future offerings for the sultan, or servants to those already favored. They never knew which fate was kinder. The women in the upper chambers, those who had lasted long enough to earn names again, understood the rules better than anyone. They knew that beauty faded fast in the eyes of men with palaces full of it, so they learned to weaponize wit, to dress each sentence with flattery, to read moods like scripture. They formed rivalries so sharp they drew blood without blades. Whispers became weapons. Laughter became a mask, and behind every smile, a quiet terror. The younger girl arriving tomorrow might be your undoing. No one could say exactly how many lived inside the harem, at once hundreds. Perhaps each woman was a breath in a tapestry that could suffocate or save her. Some rose, some vanished, some simply endured, year after year, fading into the background like old paintings left too long in the sun. The youngest learned from the oldest, and the oldest tried to forget what they had seen, what they had done, or what had been done to them. Sometimes the Sultan visited, sometimes he didn't. Either way, life went on. Perfume was applied, music rehearsed, hopes pinned to invisible threads. There was one room rarely spoken of, never entered by the uninvited, where the most favored concubines lived. It was quieter there. The silence wasn't peace. It was fear with silk gloves. These women walked slower, smiled wider, and rarely blinked. They knew that being too loved could be as dangerous as being too plain. The Sultan's heart was fickle, and the moment it wandered, so too did your safety. A jealous rival might poison your food. A whisper of disloyalty might bring the guards. And if your beauty ever waned, you might find yourself cast out, not to freedom, but to a brothel, or worse, a quiet corner of the garden where the roses grew oddly fast. Outside the palace, travelers still spoke of the harem as a place of wonder. They imagined it full of laughter, silk curtains fluttering in the breeze, fountains overflowing with rose petals, and women singing songs of love. But the women inside were not singing. Not really. If you listened closely, beneath the melody, you would hear something else, the hum of strategies, the rustle of nervous fingers, the soft echo of names they no longer used, but had not yet forgotten. And then, there were the children. Not all women in the harem remained childless. Some bore sons, some bore daughters. But motherhood was not a role. It was a risk. If your child was fathered by the Sultan, you might rise in rank. You might earn new privileges, new quarters, even a semblance of respect. But if your child was not wanted, if it threatened the hierarchy, or bore the wrong blood, then silence followed. Records show that many infants were quietly removed, their presence erased as though they had never been. Those who survived belonged not to the women who birthed them, but to the empire. They were property, not people, and property could be traded. It is said that the saddest sound in the harem was not weeping, it was the absence of it. Women learned not to cry out loud. Tears invited questions, and questions invited punishment, so they wept into pillows, or into their sleeves, or into the hollow spaces of themselves, where no guard could reach. And each night, when the lamps dimmed and the silence fell heavy, they whispered their real names into the dark, hoping that even if the empire forgot them, some part of who they had been might still exist in the night air. Some dreamed of escape. Fewer tried. The palace was built like a maze, not for beauty, but for control. Corridors led to nowhere. Doors opened only from the outside. Guards stood silent at every corner, their eyes sharp but bored. And even if you reached the gates, where would you go? Who would take in a nameless woman with no papers? Not money, and the faint scent of imperial perfume still clinging to her skin. There were stories. Of course, tales passed from woman to woman, often just before sleep. Stories of a girl who tricked the Sultan into setting her free, of another who faked her death and fled in a laundry cart, of yet another who fell in love with a guard and was spirited away by nightfall. These stories were probably lies, but they were necessary lies, the kind that held your heart together when everything else conspired to pull it apart. And so the days passed, and the years folded in on themselves like the pleats of a velvet robe. Some women remained until they were old. Others vanished before their second spring. And the empire, vast and brilliant, went on fed by conquest, gilded by wealth, and stitched together with silence. But every now and then, a new girl would arrive barefoot, wide-eyed, trembling, and the others would watch from behind their veils. They would not speak. They didn't need to. They had all been her once. And somewhere beyond the walls, the city-stirred markets bustled. Ships came and went. The muezzin sang the hours, and the world looked on, dazzled by the domes of empire, never suspecting what was hidden beneath them. While the women behind the silken curtains of the harem struggled for breath in a world that denied them ownership of their own futures, there existed another, quieter network of control This one did not glitter with gold-threaded curtains or echo with the soft music of rivalries. It began, instead, with silence deep, official silence, and with footsteps on dirt roads far from Constantinople, in villages where children still played in the dust and parents still prayed, their sons would live long enough to grow old. The boys were taken in the morning. It often began with the sound of hooves, not fast and frantic like war, but slow, practiced, purposeful. Ottoman officials, dressed in the colors of state authority, rode into Christian territories with parchment in hand and orders in ink. These were not random raids. They were devshirm, the child levy, a policy, not a crime, an imperial tax not paid in grain or gold, but in children, male children, healthy, bright-eyed, and aged between 7 and 14, though some would argue the empire did not always bother counting that precisely. Fathers stood helpless. Mothers screamed. But no resistance could halt the hands of bureaucracy. Each boy's name was recorded, his age noted, his village marked, and then he was taken, no belongings allowed, no final embrace if the soldiers deemed it unnecessary. They were marched away, sometimes in silence, sometimes sobbing, often too shocked to do either. The empire was efficient. Within weeks, the boys were transported to schools or camps where they were renamed in Turkish or Arabic, taught to forget the language of their birth, and told firmly, consistently, and with terrifying calm that their past no longer existed. They would be taught Islam, trained in obedience, and instructed that the Sultan was now their father. Most never saw their families again. To many, the most visible outcome of this system was the Janissary Corps, the elite military force of the Ottoman Empire. They were warriors without families, without distractions, and most of all, without choice. Sworn to celibacy, they became swords in the hand of the state. They marched in formation, loyal not to land or lineage, but to command. And yet, the image of glory they came to represent was born from trauma. Each shining helmet and sharpened blade had once belonged to a frightened boy who cried for his mother in a language he was now forbidden to speak. But not every boy was sent to war. Some, deemed too delicate or too beautiful for the battlefield, were chosen for a different path. These were the boys who disappeared more completely, not just from their homes, but from the empire's public memory. They were the ones who never marched, never trained with swords, never stood in formation in grand parades. Instead, they were sent to hidden corners of the palace. Some became eunuchs, others became dancers, and a few became something even more fragile, a secret so well kept, most would deny it ever existed. The eunuchs came first. The procedure was brutal, often fatal. In distant province, boys were castrated, some partially, some completely, and the survival rate was shockingly low. For every 10 children subjected to the operation, it was said only one lived. The empire considered this loss acceptable. It was not cruelty by accident. It was cruelty by design. Those who survived were divided by origin. African boys, often subjected to full removal, became black eunuchs trusted with guarding the harem and overseeing the sultan's wives and concubines. European boys, typically subject to partial removal, were labeled white eunuchs, assigned to roles in administration, domestic management, or personal service to high-ranking officials. They were often fluent in multiple languages, skilled in diplomacy, and deeply feared for their political cunning. Yet beneath the layers of silk and official function, they remained what they had been made: isolated, asexual, and cut off from every possibility of ordinary life. No love, nor children. No marriage, not even the whisper of such dreams. Then came the dancers. These were boys selected for their grace, their pliable beauty, and their silence, draped in feminine silks, faces painted with delicate care, their bodies trained to move with the softness of women. They were presented as entertainment. They performed in private feasts, festivals, and late-night gatherings offered not as musicians, but as spectacles. Their performances, often meant to amuse, could descend into chaos, as intoxicated nobles lost the thin veneer of civility. Violence was not rare, and protection was rarer still. These boys existed in the margins of gender, identity, and law, held hostage in a liminal space the empire refused to define. And still, there was one group more hidden than all the rest. They were known only by whispers. The tavşan olanlar, the bunny boys. They were not documented in the way the janissaries or eunuchs were. They were not trained, ranked, or placed into a career path. They were not mentioned in treaties, tax ledgers, or household accounts. These boys were taken for one purpose, only to satisfy the private desires of powerful men, often officials, occasionally royals, always those who understood that secrecy was part of the privilege. There were no records of where they were housed. No tombstones marked their deaths. Their names were erased from imperial ledgers. For the families left behind, there were no letters, no rumors, no soldiers returning decades later to say they had once seen a boy with familiar eyes in the corridors of Topkapi Palace. There was only silence, dense, cold, and unbreakable. Some historians believe they were kept in shadow apartments, in the deepest corners of palaces or noble estates, passed between hands, like forbidden wine. Others suggest they were discarded as soon as they lost their appeal, either quietly killed or sent to brothels where they could vanish among the ruins of their own histories. None of this is confirmed, but the very absence of confirmation speaks volumes. You cannot find a missing boy if no one admits he was ever there. And so they disappeared. Not all at once, but over decades, over centuries, a few at a time, a hand reaching through a village gate, a soldier scribbling a name in a book he would later burn, a servant delivering a tray of food to a room where no one spoke. They disappeared in silk slippers, in the scent of cardamom, in the echo of music that was never written down. They disappeared into systems that did not need them to live, only to be used. And what makes the story even harder to hold is that no monument was built to mark their passing. No national memory kept them alive. They were not martyrs, not soldiers, not revolutionaries. They left behind no journals, no letters, no known descendants. They were boys turned into shadows, and in the empire of domes and diamonds, shadows were not supposed to speak. But still, the silence echoes. In forgotten corners of the palace, where the paint has peeled and the mosaics are cracked. Some visitors claim to feel a chill, not from the wind, but from memory. In the court records of lesser officials, faint pencil notes have been found, names scratched out, lines cut short. In lullabies passed down by grandmothers in mountain villages, some verses speak of boys taken by men in red belts who never came home. And in the empty spaces of history, sometimes, silence is the loudest evidence of all. In a city famed for its mosaics and marble, where minarets pierced the sky, and merchants crossed continents to breathe the scent of its markets, one might expect that justice would unfold behind veils, in quiet corners, away from the eyes of the common crowd. But the Ottoman Empire had long since discovered a deeper kind of control, not through secrecy, but through spectacle. And so, beneath those same arches where scholars debated the nature of God, where musicians played melodies in the courtyards of power, there also stood stages of another kind, entirely city squares transformed into arenas, where punishment was no longer a consequence, but a performance. They called it justice. But what unfolded in these open-air executions was something else entirely. It was theatre gruesome, deliberate, and designed to instruct as much as to destroy. The condemned were not simply removed from society. They were displayed, dismantled, and devoured by the public eye. And it was not always for murder, or treason, or grand rebellion. Often, the most violent ends were reserved for those accused of crimes linked to morality, to gender, to sexuality, to violations of roles the empire had written in blood and law. The rituals began long before the blade fell. In the early hours, before dawn painted the domes pink with promise, prisoners were led through the alleys of Constantinople, barefoot and exposed, surrounded by guards, but more dangerously by eyes. Crowds gathered before the sun had risen. Children climbed onto crates for a better view. Vendors sold roasted chickpeas and sweet sherbet drinks, as if it were a festival, as if watching someone die was just another Saturday entertainment. The accused were stripped, not only of clothing, but of dignity. Hair was often cut unevenly, beards shaved with cruel force. Sometimes their faces were painted with ash or ink to make them ridiculous in their final moments, as though the empire wished to ensure that no trace of honor clung to their skin even as they breathed their last. It was not enough to kill. They had to humiliate. The punishment had to travel ahead of the death, like a parade of shame. And then, in the center of the square, perhaps in Sultanahmet, or a smaller town's market, they were made to kneel, or to stand, or to be bound in positions chosen not for necessity, but for spectacle. Some were displayed in cages for hours, even days, before the sentence was carried out. A living warning made flesh. Others were whipped before the final act, each lash cheered by the crowd. A few were forced to confess aloud, scripted words given by officials, rehearsed like lines in a macabre play. Whether the words were true mattered little. It was their fear that had to feel authentic. The executioners were not nameless brutes. They were professionals, selected for skill, paid per job, trained to draw out the moment just long enough to satisfy the onlookers, but not so long that the scene lost momentum, for a swift death was forgettable. A prolonged one became legend. Sometimes the condemned were men who had loved men, or women accused of infidelity, or slaves who had dared to fight back. Their crimes were not always crimes, but in an empire where power thrived on control of the body, even desire could be punished. And punished it was, with precision and spectacle. Public stoning, beatings to the point of disfigurement, mutilations that left messages on flesh long after breath had left the lungs. The crowd, at first, gasped. Then they leaned in. They grew louder. They laughed. They jeered. They wagered among themselves how many blows before the body collapsed. How long until the throat finally broke open. How far the blood might reach. These were not whispers. These were games. The square became less a place of mourning and more a pit of celebration. As if cruelty, repeated enough times, had become tradition. Children stood next to their parents and watched. Some were told it was justice. Others were told it was what happened to people who did not obey. No one was told to look away. And behind it all, in the imperial records and city ledgers, these punishments were described not in emotion but in numbers. Name, age, offense, date of execution, number of lashes, method used, witness present. There was no poetry, only policy. The documents did not tremble, but the ghosts they left behind, oh, They did. Archaeological evidence unearthed from execution sites tells a story the paper tried to forget. Skeletal remains show signs of deliberate mutilation, bones broken in ways that suggest prolonged agony. Jawbones fractured from forced silence. Ribs shattered from repeated blows. Fingers missing not from accident, but from method. These were not clumsy deaths. They were crafted. In one report, a skull was found split, not cleanly, but in a series of overlapping cracks, suggesting repeated strikes long after death should have come. Another excavation uncovered iron restraints buried deep in the dirt, rusted but unmistakably shaped to bind ankles and wrists. The past did not speak, but it did remember. But what truly ensured the power of these punishments was not their brutality alone, it was their repetition. They happened often enough to feel normal. Normal enough to feel necessary. Necessary enough to go unquestioned. And so, a generation grew up not with horror in their eyes, but indifference. There was a kind of genius in it. When cruelty becomes a ritual, it stops being seen as cruelty. It becomes a habit, a civic event, something you pass on your way to the bakery or discuss over dinner. People did not weep at executions. They brought snacks. They brought their children, and perhaps most chillingly, they brought their indifference. Not because they were evil, but because they had been taught to believe that suffering, so long as it belonged to someone else, was part of order. And so the bodies piled, some buried quickly, some left as warnings, others burned. No memorials were raised, no plaque carved. Their names fell into silence. Their faces vanished with the smoke. But sometimes, after the crowd had dispersed, and the sun had set, and the vendors had folded their carts away, someone would remain a mother, perhaps hiding beneath a veil, a lover pretending to be a stranger, a sibling who had begged the guards to spare him, and failed. These were not spectators. They were mourners without a ritual. And all they could do was gather what little was left, a shred of fabric, a strand of hair, a stain in the dirt, and carry it home, like a relic of someone who once had dreams. And there were so many dreams. Dreams of being a poet, a baker, a soldier, a singer. Dreams of seeing the sea. Dreams of a house with 3 windows and a fig tree. Dreams of love not hidden in corners. Dreams of growing old. None of these were crimes. But in the Empire's playbook, innocence was never a shield. And the stage always needed a new actor. So when you visit Istanbul now, and you walk through Sultanahmet Square, past the tourists and pigeons, past the fountains and tulip beds, you may not see the blood that once soaked these stones. You may not hear the chants. But if you stand still long enough to let the noise of the city fade, you might feel it. Not guilt, not fear, but a thin, ancient sadness stitched into the air, because no empire ever lasts forever. But its shadows, those stay longer than anyone expects. Long after the swords were sheathed and the domes stood quiet in the morning haze. Long after the crowds no longer gathered in the square and the slave markets closed their gates for the final time. The Ottoman Empire still lingered, not in politics, not in armies, not even in law, but in memory, a memory that did not shout, but whispered, a memory passed down not through monuments or official histories, but through silence. It is an odd thing how something so vast, so violent, so visibly cruel can vanish from public speech, and yet remain etched in the gestures of the old, in the lullabies of grandmothers, in the way certain names are never spoken again. Empires fall loudly, but traumas survive quietly. In the villages where the child levy once stole sons from doorsteps, there grew a superstition, one never written, but always understood. When a boy turned 7, mothers began tying talismans to his wrist, threads soaked in vinegar, pomegranate juice, and prayer. They would sleep beside him, refuse to let him out of sight. Some fathers would hide their sons in cellars or dress them as girls for a time. And if you asked why, they would not say the Ottomans, or the Janissaries, or the levy. They would say, simply, for protection. They did not need to say more. There were villages where no songs were sung about certain years. Years when the carts came, when boys were marched off and never returned. These absences became seasons of their own, known by the harvests that followed. Thinner, weaker, tilled by old men who should have been resting, and girls who had learned not to hope for husbands. No one built memorials to those boys. There were no records to mark their lives. But their loss was stitched into every corner of daily life. In cities, among women descended from those once locked in the harem, stories took a different form. Not open grief, but caution and inherited tightness around the mouth. A warning folded into advice. Do not speak too loudly. Do not draw too much attention. Be beautiful, but not too much. Be clever, but never too clever in front of men. And most of all, never trust a world that calls you valuable. That word, valuable, had once been used in the slave markets to describe price, not worth. And so, generation after generation, women learned to move quietly, to protect themselves not just from danger, but from memory, because the danger had passed, but the memory had not. There were families in Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Caucasus who kept heirlooms behind locked cupboards. A scarf said to belong to a great-grandmother from the harem. A belt passed down from a soldier who had once guarded palace gates. A miniature Quran inscribed with a name no one dared translate. These objects were not displayed. They were not explained. They were carried, not for pride, but for proof. Proof that someone had survived, even if what they survived could not be spoken of. In some households, it was the absence that spoke loudest. A branch of the family tree that ended suddenly. A relative no one mentioned. A surname changed without reason. A photograph torn at the edge. The questions children asked. Who was this? Why did we leave that village? What happened to her were answered with soft hands and tighter silences. Some histories, it was believed, were too heavy for young hearts. But the silence left its own weight. And children, sensitive to things adults forget how to feel, learned early that some truths live between the lines. And so the empire survived not in glory, but in discomfort, not in maps, but in family gatherings, where certain topics were avoided, where certain eyes grew distant when the conversation wandered too close to old rooms, old names, old griefs. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early years of the 20th century, no truth commissions were held, no national apologies were made. The new governments were busy rebuilding, redrawing borders, and rewriting futures. The past was treated like a liability, something too dark, too divisive, too inconvenient, and so the silence was preserved, not only by the people who had suffered, but by the very states that had replaced the empire. Archives were closed, schools taught a simplified history, and the stories that had once circulated in whispers retreated even further into dream, into metaphor, into myth. But myths, if you listen carefully, are often just censored memories. There is a lullaby sung in parts of eastern Anatolia about a bird who flies too close to the palace and loses her song. Another about a river that carries the names of children who never returned. These are not political ballads. They are not revolutionary songs. They are bedtime melodies. But the pain within them is unmistakable. The child sings the tune. The parent closes their eyes. And somewhere between verse and silence, history exhales. The trauma was not just individual. It was structural, generational, intimate. It seeped into parenting styles, into how affection was shown or not shown, into how freedom was imagined or feared. In many families, discipline was harsh, not out of cruelty, but out of inherited terror. Better to control them now, some would say, than lose them later. Love became cautious, praise became whispered, and children grew up learning not just to be good, but to be invisible when it mattered. There were therapists, much later, in cities far from the empire's heart, who would sit across from clients, descended from Ottoman survivors, and sense something unusual, a fear of hierarchy, a reluctance to trust institutions, a deep ambivalence about beauty, about desire, about attention. Sometimes the client could not explain it, could not name where it came from, but the fear was real, and the pain was real, and the silence that sat between them was not their silence. It was older. And what of the empire itself, those who once ruled it, those who built its systems, who profited from its structures? Some descendants of Ottoman elites live now in modern cities, educated, global, polite. Some know the history, some deny it. Some say it was a different time, and perhaps it was. But time, on its own, does not heal. It only deepens the burial. Even today, in museums and archives, there are gaps where documents should be. Gaps in the biographies of powerful men whose private lives were too disturbing to record. Gaps in the birth and death records of palace children. Gaps in the economic ledgers that make human trafficking look like trade. These are not absences, they are erasures. And erasure is the final trick of empire. But silence, as heavy as it is, can be broken. Sometimes a scholar finds a letter misfiled in a box marked textiles and discovers a woman's desperate plea to have her child returned. Sometimes a descendant opens a drawer and finds a portrait with eyes too familiar to be forgotten. Sometimes a storyteller, far from the empire's reach, sits down to whisper into a microphone and says the names no one dared say. And when they do, the silence breaks. A little. It does not undo the pain. It does not return the stolen. But it does something else. It makes space. Space to mourn. Space to remember. Space to say this happened. It mattered. And it is not forgotten. Because history, when held with care, is not just a weight. It is a bridge. And maybe, just maybe, if we walk it slowly enough, we can carry the stories forward not in shame, not in rage, but in recognition that even the darkest truths deserve to be held in the light. In the heart of Istanbul, the stone steps remain. They are worn now, softened by centuries of feet, some heavy with purpose, others hesitant with fear. The palace walls still stand, though their paint has faded and their gold leaf has dulled. The fountains no longer run with perfume, and the air that once carried the music of zithers and whispered commands now hangs quiet, touched only by birds and tourists and time. The empire is gone, but it is not gone. Empires, you see, do not vanish. Not entirely. They shift. They settle. They fold themselves into the bones of cities and the blood of families. They linger in the cracks between languages. In the gestures passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. In the pause before a man reaches for a door he knows was once locked from the outside. In the silence between two people who know better than to ask each other how they learn to endure. What remains of the Ottoman Empire is not just Topkapi Palace or blue-tiled mosques or the minarets that still rise like spears into the Turkish sky. What remains is the architecture of feeling, the blueprint of power that continues to echo in rooms that no longer echo with footsteps. What remains is not stone, but memory, not law, but habit, not rule, but reflex. There are ruins? Of course, there always are. Ruins are the easy remnants, the ones we photograph, preserve, place behind glass. The ruins of the Ottoman world are majestic hammams with high domes and marble slabs, caravanserais long abandoned to ivy and goats, aqueducts that once sang with water, now dry as parchment. The empire knew how to build, it knew how to last, and so the ruins are many and magnificent. But the more intimate ruins are harder to see. They live in the forgotten burial sites of eunuchs who served for 50 years and died without names. In the silence of courtyards where slave girls once danced in veils for men who laughed and forgot them. In the dusty corners of libraries where ledgers list human beings by weight and skin tone and price. These are ruins you cannot touch, only feel. And yet they are the ones that shape us the most. In the modern city, you might walk through a market square and hear a woman say to her daughter, "Keep your voice down. Girls must not be noticed." You might sit in a classroom where the history teacher lingers long on battles and dates, but skips entirely the story of the harem, of the levy, of the bodies used to build victory. You might see a boy flinch when he is praised for being pretty. You might notice that certain graves are unmarked, that certain families do not speak of their great-grandparents, that certain songs are only sung to infants and never in public. These are not Ottoman laws. The laws are gone. But the shape of empire still casts a shadow. And people, especially people who have suffered, learn to move in shadow. And so what remains is not just cultural pride, or architectural glory, or national story. What remains is also dissonance. It is the feeling of standing in a beautiful room, knowing that once, not long ago, someone screamed here, that the silk curtains once muffled, not laughter, but sobs. That the very marble beneath your feet once bore the blood of a body no one mourned. And yet, the light still falls through the window just so, and the call to prayer still rises like a promise, and a child still chases pigeons through the courtyard, unaware of anything except the joy of running. This is the contradiction of inheritance. Beauty layered over pain. Pain folded into beauty. There are, of course, those who wish to forget, who say, "Why tell these stories? Why dig up the past? Why speak of blood and sorrow when we have art and poetry and empire and pride?" And to them, one might answer gently, because we carry it whether we speak it or not, because silence is not absence, because not every ruin is dead, and because those who suffered deserve more than silence. The boy who was taken at 7 and renamed and never saw his mother again, he is not a footnote. The woman who died in childbirth in the harem, whose child was sold to another palace, she is not a shadow. The man publicly mutilated for loving someone he was told not to, he is not a warning. They were human. They hoped. They ached. They feared. They laughed. Perhaps only once. And they deserve to be remembered not for what was done to them, but for who they were before. Empires have always told their stories through monuments and victory, through conquest and dynasty, through maps and medals. But the truest story, the soft story, the breathing story is told through the things that didn't make it into the archives. The pause in the middle of a folk song, the smell of rose water that makes a woman cry, and she doesn't know why. The way a family never names its sons after a certain ancestor. The dreams of a teenager who writes poetry in secret. Terrified. Someone might read it. What remains of empire is, in the end, what we choose to carry, and what we choose to release. There are descendants of those who ruled, and they must decide whether to meet this past with denial or responsibility. There are descendants of those who served, and they must decide whether to pass on silence or voice. There are descendants of those who vanished, and they must decide whether the wound will end with them or speak through them. And for the rest of us, those who walk through these stories as guests, as students, as listeners, our task is simpler, but no less sacred. We must remember, not in anger, not in guilt, but in recognition, that this happened, that it mattered, that human beings can build civilizations that shimmer like gold, and yet rest upon bodies we dare not name, and that now, standing where they once stood, we have a chance to do something different, to speak gently of the past, to hold space for the unseen, to let the ruins breathe, to name the silences, and to tell the stories, even the darkest ones like lullabies, soft enough to sleep to, strong enough to survive. Because when empire is finally gone, when all that's left is wind and dust and song, what remains is not the crown, or the sword, or the name in the book. What remains is the breath between stories, and how we choose to carry it. But sometimes, the past doesn't end. It doesn't dissolve like old parchment. It doesn't stay behind stone walls or closed libraries. Sometimes it breathes, quietly, but fully, and if you're very still, very quiet, and listening with more than your ears, you might just hear it. There is a room in a quiet part of the old city. No sign hangs above its door. No tourist brochure marks it. It is neither grand nor gilded. But those who enter often without knowing why say that the room feels full, even when no one is there. Some call it the echo room, though no echo is ever heard in sound. The story goes that this room once belonged to no one, that it was carved out of forgotten space, an error in the architecture, a room behind a wall that had no plans. Yet the wind always seems to find it. And pseudo-stories. It is said that the walls here remember one visitor, an old woman, wrapped in a plum-coloured shawl, once stepped inside, and for no reason she could name, began to weep. She said later that the room smelled like lavender, smoke, and iron, the scent of a courtyard where her grandmother had once hidden a gold coin beneath her tongue during a raid. She hadn't thought of that memory in 60 years. Another came in as a child, chasing a stray cat through the corridor. He stopped in the room and stayed, silent, for several minutes. When his mother found him, he whispered. The room was breathing. No one corrected him. Not even the guide who had lived in the building all his life. Some say the room was once a sleeping chamber for a young servant boy who had grown too clever for the kitchens, that he'd been moved here not as a promotion, but as a pause, that he'd known secrets no one his age should know, and that after his time here, he had vanished without a word. Some say the last thing he wrote, carved faintly on the wall behind a tapestry, were 4 words in 4 languages. Don't forget the small. Others believe the room belonged to no one in particular, only to silence itself. It is not haunted. Not in the way stories usually mean. There are no shadows, no whispers, just presence, an awareness, like something that knows it was once filled with the weight of bodies, and now has only breath and wind and time. But when people sit in the room not rushing, not photographing, just sitting, something happens. They begin to remember, not just facts, not names or dates or dynasties, but feelings, a memory of being watched too closely, a memory of hiding something precious, a memory of standing in a line, unsure why, a memory of love so dangerous it had to stay locked behind the teeth, a memory of almost speaking and then choosing not to. Some of these memories are not theirs, but they arrive, as if carried by dust, as if passed down not through stories, but through skin. It is said that one night, A musician sat in the echo room for hours, and when she left, she composed a song so sorrowful and soft that audiences cried without knowing why. The lyrics were simple, almost childish. When I was a window, I dreamed of being a door. She never said what it meant, but in Istanbul, they sing it as a lullaby now. The stories that live in this room are not loud. They do not demand justice, or apologies, or monuments. They are tired stories, but not dead ones. They ask only to be held, and so, in this room, we try to do that. We sit with the boy who danced in silks and could no longer remember his name, with the mother who kept her baby quiet by pressing her own palm against its mouth, with the eunuch who rose to power but never slept without a blade beneath his bed, with the girl who ran from the palace not for freedom, but because she knew if she stayed, she would forget the sound of her own voice. We sit with them all, not to fix them, not to pity them, but to remember them, to remind ourselves that they existed, that they mattered, that they were not footnotes or curiosities, that they were people who once had skin and sleep and slivers of hope and who deserved to be more than metaphors. And when we remember them softly, respectfully, something else happens. We begin to remember ourselves, the times we stayed quiet to survive, the ways we shaped ourselves to be acceptable, the jokes we swallowed, the dreams we shelved, the small betrayals of self we endured because it was safer than being seen. Empires do not invent cruelty, but they do teach us how to inherit it through patterns, through silences, through what we normalize and what we excuse. But in remembering, we interrupt. We lay down the blade. We open the locked door. We say the name no one dared speak. And in doing so, we let light touch the bruise. We let breath return to the story. That is what remains of empire, not power, not territory, but choice. The choice to listen differently, to see the past not as distance, but as inheritance, and to decide here, now what part of that inheritance we will carry forward, and what part we will gently, lovingly, finally put down. And if, after all that, you are still awake, perhaps you'll hear the room breathing. 2. It sounds like the wind through fig leaves. It sounds like footsteps never taken. It sounds like your own breath slow, steady, no longer hiding. It sounds like rest, in a quiet archive in the city of Bursa, among dust and parchment and records once thought lost. A book was discovered. It had no title, no author, no decoration on the cover, just a slim leather-bound volume, with pages that crackled like old leaves and handwriting that changed halfway through, as if the writer had either been replaced or disappeared. The archivists who found it didn't think much of it at first. It looked like a clerk's personal log, nothing more, but as they turned its pages, the shape of something older began to appear, not a diary, not an official decree, but something in between. It began with a list of names, some marked with dates of birth, others with dashes. Most had no surname, just one name, and beside them, a note taken from Kavala. Winter, taken from Vardar. Spring, mother cried, refused to let go. These were not soldiers, not merchants, not ministers. These were children, most no older than 10. There were no imperial seals on the page, no signatures from pashas or scribes. And yet, the detail, the precision was chilling. Page after page recorded the villages visited, the number of children selected, the number rejected, the ones who died en route, and the names of those who showed signs of discipline or potential. This was not fiction. Cross-referenced with Ottoman court records, taxation logs, and accounts from European envoys, the entries aligned almost perfectly. Even some of the names matched with later records from Topkapi Palace, listed under pages servants, or, in rare cases, eunuchs. But the most haunting part was the final entry, not written in black ink like the rest, but in a faded red pigment, as if the writer had no other ink left. It simply read, "They are gone." I no longer remember which voices were mine. The handwriting ends there. No one knows who wrote it. Some speculate it was a scribe assigned to record the Devshirme collections. Others think it was a parent, forced to assist, and then slowly turned complicit. A few believe it was a boy taken, trained, taught to write, and finally allowed to keep a record. None of it is certain. What is certain is that the names in that book belong to real children, and that most of them never came back. It is easy to talk about empire in abstract, to study borders, battles, maps, to name sultans and summarize reigns. But in this book, this unfinished, unnamed book empire becomes personal. It becomes quiet and devastating and unbearably close. And the fact that it was never finished somehow makes it more real, as if the story itself was interrupted. Like so many lives were, there are other records scattered across the former empire that tell versions of the same story. In the Venetian State Archives, there is a report from the year 1588, describing a group of Greek boys marched through the mountains with chains around their ankles, destined for Adrianople. In Dubrovnik, a nobleman's letter warns his brother to hide his sons before the levy riders arrive. In the memoirs of a Hungarian priest, he describes hiding behind haystacks while two of his students were taken in the night. These are not rumors. These are written, signed, sealed accounts, and yet for centuries, they remained buried beneath stories of Ottoman tolerance, administration, architecture, and yes, those things were real too. The empire was not a monolith of cruelty. It built bridges, protected minorities at times, cultivated poetry and medicine. But empires, like people, contain contradiction, and for all its sophistication, the Ottoman system relied undeniably on the erasure of self. Whether that erasure came in the form of castration, renaming, forced conversion, or simple silence, it left wounds, not just on individuals, but on entire lineages. In the village of Berat, Albania, old women still tell the story of Leka, a boy taken during the levy. They say his mother braided a red thread into his shirt and told him, "If you ever forget me, your soul will forget itself." Some versions say he became a janissary who died in battle. Others say he was never seen again. But every spring, to this day, the village girls braid red threads into their brothers' cuffs, not as decoration, but as memory. In parts of Bosnia, there are lullabies that refer to the night horse, a metaphor for the riders who came to take children. One line, translated loosely, says, "Sleep, child, not too deep, lest you ride where roads do not return." These are not coincidences. These are cultural scar tissues woven into ritual and rhyme. And yet, what's striking is not only the pain, it's the tenderness with which this pain is held. Rarely are these stories told with hatred. They are not about vengeance. They are about grief. Quiet grief, the kind that teaches children to hold their siblings tightly, to sing to them even when there is no danger, to speak their names over and over, so no one will ever forget them. Because if empire is about control, then remembrance is a kind of resistance. And if silence was once enforced, then story told gently, carefully, without shouting becomes a kind of balm. Today, across the lands that once made up the Ottoman realm, there are museums filled with swords and turbans and ceramics. There are coffee houses named for sultans. There are television dramas painting grand palaces in warm amber light. And somewhere, in between those official narratives and romanticized nostalgia, there are still people, ordinary people, who carry fragments of truth in their hearts. A name that doesn't make sense in the family tree. A recurring dream of a hallway with no doors. A memory that feels older than one's body. These are the things that remain. Not gold, not glory, but questions. And that is why stories like these soft, slow, sometimes painful must continue. Not to accuse, not to reopen wounds, but to care for the ones that were never allowed to close properly. Because if we do not finish the book, we at least owe it a place on the shelf. If we cannot find the boy who vanished, we at least owe him a name. If we cannot undo the policies that turned people into property, we at least owe those people our attention. And in the stillness of that, we begin to hear something new. Not just echoes of the past, but breath. Because when the story is told fully, truthfully, and with compassion, the silence finally rests. And so can we. There is a street in Edern where the stones underfoot are so smooth they feel like river pebbles. The walls on either side rise modestly, sun-warmed and unadorned. At first glance, there is nothing remarkable. No minaret. No marker. Not even a plaque. But if you ask one of the oldest shopkeepers at the far corner, the one who sells polished copper pots and swears he never left the city, he might pause for a long time before saying, "There used to be a wall here, but no one remembers it. No drawings, no photographs, no architectural plans, just stories. And even those come in fragments, pieces of dreams, things overheard as a child, or told once and never again. It was not a prison wall, not officially. It didn't guard anything of political importance. No soldiers walked its perimeter. And yet, what was behind it, according to those who whisper, still was one of the quietest cruelties of the Ottoman system. A place where women went when they no longer mattered. Not just concubines, not just disgraced favorites, but also wet nurses whose children had died, dancers who had aged past the Sultan's taste, healers who had said the wrong thing. And sometimes, simply, women who had loved the wrong person at the wrong time, in the wrong room. There was no trial, only transfer. One night, you slept on embroidered silk. The next, you were told to pack not your belongings, just your body, and follow a man who did not speak. Behind the wall was a house, not large, not entirely bleak. The women there were fed, bathed, given clean clothes. No shackles, no physical abuse. It was not punishment. It was containment. You were not meant to suffer. You were meant to disappear. The locals called it Ev Unuchulanla, the House of the Forgotten. Some said it was part of the palace welfare system. Others insisted it was an informal arrangement to protect sensitive cases. But the truth, as always, lives in the gaps. One former guard many decades later wrote anonymously that his post was the quietest in the empire, that no one screamed, that the women he saw never cried, at least not in front of him, that once, in 15 years, a woman tried to run, not to escape, but simply to feel what it was like to move quickly again. She didn't make it past the inner courtyard. They didn't beat her. They just closed the door again. He said the hardest part was the singing. They sang lullabies. He wrote, but there were no children. There are no official records of the House of the Forgotten. No budget lines. No staff registries. But some names appear in medical notes from the harem, hastily crossed out with annotations like transferred. No further care required. One file mentions a woman named Layla, who lost her voice due to prolonged silence. Another mentions derangement from unstructured routine. One simply says, "Found sitting in courtyard. Arms folded. Eyes open. Unable to identify own name. It was not torture. That would have made the Empire look brutal. This was worse. It was indifference. The kind that slowly folds a life into paper. After the fall of the Empire, the house was emptied. Quietly. No announcement. No ceremony. Just one morning. Neighbors noticed the laundry lines were gone. The shadows in the windows didn't move anymore. And by winter, the doors were bricked shut. For a time, children would dare each other to touch the wall. Some swore they heard humming. Others said they saw a figure in white at the second window. But the fear faded with time. The wall was taken down in the late 1950s to make room for new shops. And yet the street still feels thin, like something was erased too fast. And the ghost of it is still trying to catch up. And perhaps that is the most lasting legacy of an empire like this. Not the palaces that remain, but the absences that persist. The spaces where stories should be, the bodies never buried, the lives unspoken. A modern historian once said that the Ottoman system excelled at the management of human life, but he forgot to mention what it cost, not just to those who were taken, silenced, discarded, but to those who watched and learned to do nothing. A merchant who saw a child dragged from his mother's arms and kept walking. A midwife who delivered 10 children in the harem and never asked what happened to the girls. A dancer who trained her replacement with a smile, even as her room was reassigned before sunset. They were not evil. They were accustomed, and that is what empire teaches best. The habit of not noticing, and yet even in the margins, there were flickers. A woman who sewed her name into the lining of her robe, hoping someone would find it later. A eunuch who taught a boy to read not just Turkish, but Greek, as a gift he was forbidden to give. A janissary who looked back at his village as they marched away just once, even though he had been taught to forget. And sometimes, flickers are enough. In the year 2019, during renovations near the Selimiye Mosque, workers uncovered a hidden storage chamber. Inside were pieces of wood, faded cloth, and fragments of painted tiles. But among them was something unexpected. A small metal charm, shaped like a leaf, with an inscription in Armenian. It read, "She sang to remember." No one knows how it got there. Perhaps it belonged to one of the women from the House of the Forgotten. Perhaps it came from somewhere else entirely. But archaeologists cleaned it gently, placed it behind glass, and now in a quiet corner of the Edirne Museum, it sits on a blue velvet cloth, under a small sign that simply says, "Anonymous. Circa 17th century. Visitors don't linger long there. Most come for the weapons, the jewelry, the portraits of sultans. But once in a while, someone will stop and stare and whisper the words under their breath. She sang to remember, and just like that, the room breathes again. Somewhere, between the rustle of museum curtains and the slow breath of a sleeping city, the stories begin to quiet. Not because they are over, but because they have been heard, truly heard. And in the world of the forgotten that is everything, no empire truly ends in war. Not really. It ends in forgetting. In the slow unthreading of names from memory, in the doors that are never opened again, in the stories told one last time, and then not again. But what you have done by listening, by staying, by holding space for what was broken and buried, is the opposite of empire. You have remembered. You did not rush past the ruined hallway. You stepped into it. You did not silence the crying dancer. You sat with her until the music returned. You did not look away from the child in the ledger. You read his name, whispered it, maybe, or just held it gently in your chest, like a pebble warm from the sun. And so now, the story settles, not as a sharp ending, but as a final room. In this room, there are no chains, no titles, no silk curtains, no guards at the door, only low light, worn cushions, the smell of lavender and wood, and in the center, a small wooden box. Inside the box are letters, hundreds of them, none written during the Empire, all written after, by grandchildren, by researchers, by strangers, by poets, none with all the facts, but each one filled with something rare care. One simply says, "I dreamed of a girl with no name. I gave her mine." Another reads, "My great-grandfather was a janissary. I am teaching my son how to cry." And one, almost too simple to notice, says only, "Thank you for surviving." Somewhere, a lullaby is being hummed in a language the Empire tried to erase. Somewhere, a tourist walks past a gate and feels the wind shift, not cold, but full, as if the air remembers footsteps no longer there. And somewhere, maybe in you, the silence has softened, not vanished, not rewritten, just softened, made space for rest, because you were never meant to carry it all, just enough to keep the light from going out. And now, it is late. The sky outside is darker now, the city quiet, the books closed, and though history still breathes, still rustles in corners and beneath carpets, it no longer needs to speak so loudly. Because someone you was listening, you do not need to fix the past, you only need to let it sleep. And perhaps, in doing so, you'll sleep too, with a little more softness, a little more space, a little less forgetting. Good night, for you, and for them, forever remembered, forever released,